Let's try a little bit of a fun story. It's about the connection between the watch and why you and I speak English. Never thought about it, I guess. Alright, I'm going to split my story into three parts. A little bit of history, just a little bit of science, and then of course the connection between the two. Let's get into the history part. I want to take us back to an age in about the 1700s. This is perhaps still regarded as the golden age of discovery, although I think it's not quite appropriate to call it the discovery age because much of the world had already been discovered. It's more about an age of, if you can call it, domination. It's about trying to dominate the world. Anyway, during this age there are three competing nations, Portugal, the Netherlands and the UK. These are the three big seafaring nations, and they have been pretty much working out all the routes, pretty much establishing colonies throughout the world, and they are trading. They are bringing products back home to their respective countries and making themselves rich in the process. Alright, the major issue that these three countries are having between each other is about trying to dominate the world. And in essence, these three countries are stuck in a literal sailing race. Who can get out to whichever colony, to whichever outpost, fill their boat and get it back the quickest. And they are kind of stuck with a sort of bit of an issue going on there. It has to do with navigation. That's actually now going to bring us into the second part of our story. It's about the science of sailing. In navigation there are two primary ways to know where you are, basically latitude and longitude. And up until about the early 1700s, most seafaring nations had pretty much figured out the latitude part. And that's actually quite simple for me to explain quite briefly. It has to do with calculating the angle between the sun and the horizon during the course of the day. You pretty much measure the angle between the horizon and the sun as it goes up to the peak level and then back down again. And you really just want to get that peak angle. And put quite simply, as you sail up approaching the equator, that angle starts to increase, and as you sail away from the equator, that angle starts to decrease. Have a bunch of charts and tables knowing what time of the year it is, and you can figure out your latitude. Now the downside of only knowing latitude is that you still don't quite know where you are going east or west. And in essence, what most nations used to do at that time was sail along the coastline. And by sailing along the coastline, in essence, they wouldn't get lost. At this stage, I must actually point out that not all sailors sailed along the coastline, and what people like Christopher Columbus did, sailing directly across the Atlantic Ocean, is very impressive for his day and age, because he didn't know where he was on a longitude level. He knew where he was latitude, but anyway. So the issue here with sailing along the coastline is that you're not sailing in the most straightest or most direct route, so to speak. And sailors back in that time had already figured out that if they could figure out longitude and they could know exactly where they were on this world, they could perhaps start sailing in more straighter lines. They had figured out what it took to work out longitude, which is a quick lesson I'm going to give you right now. It's actually quite simple when I explain it this way. What you need to do is set a time to a specific location to sunrise. So what I mean by that is, let's say you are in the UK, in London, and you see the sunrise. You're going to set a specific time. It doesn't really matter what time, but let's say arbitrarily you set your watch to 7 o'clock in the morning to say the sun has risen at 7 o'clock in the morning. Get in your boat and start sailing westwards. If that sun starts rising later, particularly at 7:04, you have moved 1 full degree westwards. If it rises at 7:08 in the morning, you have moved 2 degrees westwards. This is actually not too difficult to work out. The math of it is that the world rotates, does a full rotation in 24 hours. There are 360 degrees. So you work out the 24 hours into a form of minutes and divide one by the other, and you basically you work out that the world is rotating by 1 degree every 4 minutes. I think you can well imagine this is not too difficult to work out. If you consider, for example, the sun rises in London a good 5 hours before it rises in New York, and London is 75 degrees of longitude difference to New York. Now once you can figure this out, again, you can actually sail in straight lines. Now, knowing that knowing this concept, the sailors of the time tried various methods to put clocks on boats. So they already had invented the clock by the 1700s. The French in 1650 actually made an attempt to put what we would know today as a grandfather clock on a sailboat. And I think, as many of you might know, the grandfather clock is heavily reliant on that pendulum that swings backwards and forwards, and you put that onto a sailboat that is busy rocking from one side to the other, it all becomes quite a bit of a disaster. It didn't work out too well for them. In essence, they knew what they needed: a reliable watch that wasn't going to be affected by the movements of the boat. I think you can already start getting an idea of where I'm getting to with this. The British government in the early 1700s put out what today we would know as an X Prize type of competition to the person or organization that could develop what they would call the tachyometer. Now, as it turns out, yes, the British were the first to invent the watch, which gave them a good advantage. The whole story behind the invention of the watch is quite an involved story all on its own. It took the poor guy 30 years to convince the British government that this was a good working tachyometer. Nonetheless, when they put it into use, as you can well imagine, the British started sailing in straight lines. And this was a very, very important technological development. I cannot underestimate or cannot underemphasize how important this technological development was. You see, the Portuguese were the first to work out the routes eastwards. They were the first to make their way all the way through to Japan and quite literally around the world. But when the Dutch arrived, the Dutch were a lot more, how would I put it? They were a little bit more aggressive in their work as far as trading, as far as setting up trading posts, and they kind of pushed the Portuguese out of their way. Well, the English came around and did to the Dutch what the Dutch did to the Portuguese. And having this sort of historical knowledge, the English realized that there were two new players in this game, the French and the Spanish. The Spanish already had quite a bit of a history out in South America, but they were now making their way off to the east to places like the Philippines and Indonesia. So knowing this, it was even more important to have a presence out in the various colonies and outposts at that moment in time, and all the more important why they needed to get out there quicker. So yeah, it was the invention of the watch that got the British out there and got them to rule the world. And of course you can see the ramifications of that. You and I are currently listening and speaking to each other in English. Was it solely the watch that is the reason why we speak English? No, it wasn't. But it was definitely a strong contributor. It was a technological development that quite literally put the British well ahead of their competitors. And that's it for this story. If you liked it, please press that button. The YouTube algorithm will hopefully start sharing this video if you press that button. And of course, subscribing would help me a lot. And I say thank you very much.